introduction to everybody. Hello, my name is Talia. Here we are at the guest Burns Night Cookalong. I'm joined by Ali Lloyd from the Luna Project. So we're going to be chatting a little bit about the accessibility of sustainability while we make her delicious Haggis Nachos recipe, which I'm very excited for. Ali, how are you doing today?
I'm really good, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm feeling happy. I'm also feeling very excited to eat this. I feel like we'll get started on the cooking and then we can get into our chats just so we're all in motion. So step one is creating our nachos from our tortillas. So first of all, we're brushing our tortillas with oil, yes?
Chef's choice. I feel like I think I'm gonna oil them and then cut them so that I can try and cut multiple at once. But I think that's the joy. Haggis Nachos, I think you can do it literally any order, any way, and it'll come together, hopefully.
Excellent wisdom. So as we do this step, as we brush our tortillas in oil and cut them in a moment, would you like to tell us a little bit about the Luna Project?
Yeah, so the Luna Project is a small charity. It is run by young people, by a mixture of disabled and able-bodied young people, and it's kind of why it was set up is to raise awareness of and support young people who are disabled or living with chronic illnesses. So that could be anything like chronic mental illness, physical disability, neurodiversity, literally a whole spectrum of things. But we're the real focus is young people, from young people, for young people.
Am I right in saying you are one of the founders of the Luna Project?
Yeah, so it was set up by me and the lovely Ross, who is here tonight, and our other friend Beth. We set up the Luna Project maybe, Ross, you can jump in and correct me, but I think maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, because we'd been at uni for a little bit and we were having all of these issues and all these experiences that we felt other people just weren't having, and we didn't see being talked about anywhere. And we were surely, if 1 in 8 young people are disabled, surely other people are having these experiences and issues, even if they're not being talked about. And so we were kind of we want to talk about them because they need to be talked about. And so it all kind of went from there. It started very small. It was just the 3 of us. We started off doing these workshops, bringing those conversations about disability, taking it off individuals with disabilities, and in which all of a sudden everyone in that classroom would have a responsibility for having these conversations about accessibility, chronic illness, etc. And we also at the same time started a blog to try and talk and our experiences as a friendship group.
To me, as kind of someone who follows the Luna Project and likes looking at all your resources and I just think you guys are great. Okay, first of all, for our kind of segue into chatting about sustainability, I thought first of all, I know when we last spoke, we spoke a little bit about kind of the individualized nature of what often is kind of the discourse around sustainability, and particularly sustainable eating, kind of I focus on, and how that is often kind of painted as an individual responsibility. And just I wondered if you would like to say a little bit about why that isn't very helpful in a lot of ways, especially when we're talking about accessibility.
When I knew we were doing this and I started thinking about what is it about the sustainability and environmental movement that feels inaccessible and has, in my experience, been inaccessible, and I think a lot of it, as you said, is this culture around individual change in a way that isn't particularly flexible and doesn't really allow for difference, putting the responsibility for solving the climate crisis on individuals, and when there are all these big companies and corporations who actually if they change their actions, then all of a sudden that would be what's gonna steer the difference. And that's not to say that individual change isn't important, because it definitely is. I think it's really important that in conversations about individual change, there is that room for flexibility and that idea that like actually, you know, we can do what we can and everyone will be doing that in different ways, and not demonizing people who can't do that and not excluding them from those conversations. So I think quite like a high profile conversation around this was with the whole like banning straws things, when everyone like got obsessed with like, we've got to ban straws, like they are like what is pushing us over the edge with the climate crisis kind of thing. And disabled people were saying like, oh, hold up, like actually straws are a really important accessibility thing for me, like I need straws. This is the difference between me being able to drink this and not. Surely you can see how important that is. And so I think, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question at all, but I think that
answers my question. And it's really interesting. I also think, like, particularly with the debate, like for that example with straws, the kind of question of if you make them, like after we had our chat, I was kind of like, okay, I'll do a little bit of extra reading, I'll like find what I can see, and kind of people talking about how then like a further solution was, oh well, okay, we'll just kind of have a few plastic straws under the bar, which then people, if they need them, can ask for. But then like it creates a whole power dynamic with people having to ask or kind of prove their disability or prove like their access needs. So totally, like it's something that, as you say, like it's a conversation that needs to include the voices of the people that it affects. Kind of going on from that, so talking about, and I know we spoke a little bit about how once, like for me personally, knowing about the climate crisis, it's kind of it feels like one way in which I can make a difference is to eat a certain way or kind of try and make sustainable choices. But obviously those choices aren't accessible for everybody. So then maybe if you are kind of passionate about climate change, you might like to be involved in other ways. But then I know that you have kind of an awareness of the lack of accessibility often in those kind of other things that we could be doing to address the climate crisis, which also are kind of made inaccessible for a lot of people. So segueing onto that, if you have any thoughts. Also, how's like, just before I get you to answer another big question, how are you doing in terms of your tortilla preparations?
I think mine are going good. You know what, because I said I'd make for my flatmates too, and I'm looking at all the tortillas I'm doing, I'm like, gosh, there's definitely going to be enough for all of us and all our neighbours. How are you doing?
They're looking good. I have quite a lot. I selected like the largest tray that I have, and I think it still might be too small. So I might have to go for a second tray, but no complaints there.
Yeah, I would definitely say that would be a top tip for these is yeah, not having them overlapping, even if it means using 2 trays when you actually think you only need 1, because otherwise you've got some that are done and some that are still soft and a nightmare.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm now going to embark on a hunt for a second tray. Okie dokie. So now we're moving on. We're saying individualized kind of actions to combat climate change aren't accessible for everybody. We shouldn't be made to feel like that's all that we do or all that we can do. What else can we do, and what are some of the problems with those things for people with different accessibility requirements?
Yeah, so I think that this kind of leads nicely into a conversation about essentially where these conversations are happening. So obviously there's so many things you can do to like, you know, like play your part in like trying to combat the climate crisis, and a lot of that is through like perhaps like activism groups, or just being part of any kind of group, and you know, flying the flag for like, are we thinking about the environment here, that kind of thing. But it can be quite problematic because often these meetings that are like, say like climate crisis activism type stuff, may not be held in a space that's accessible, whether that like be physically, it may be that it's being held upstairs, or it may be, if it's online, it may be being held on a platform that doesn't have captions, any of these kind of things. And that means that then you kind of have a bit of an issue where in these meetings, maybe someone raises the idea of like, oh, you know, straws, that's what we should do. And then because there's no disabled people in that meeting, because they haven't been able to like access the meeting, you kind of then have this thing where everyone's like, yeah, great idea, that sounds great, that works for me, let's go with that. When actually if you had disabled people there, they'd be able to very quickly be like, see where you're coming from, but actually maybe let's rethink what we're thinking here. And that kind of like repeats itself a lot, like these conversations being had that actually disabled people should be in these conversations, because disabled people are like 25% of society, like that's a huge number. And then when they're not there, these conversations are being taken in a way that means that like what it means to be like someone who does sustainability or someone who is like doing their bit for the climate crisis, like that becomes a shape that disabled people can no longer fit because they haven't been in the conversations to get to that point. And that means that you have a situation where if you're a disabled person, you're looking at this and you're like, well, I feel really disenfranchised from this because this isn't a movement that works for me at all. And this isn't a movement that seems to consider my needs. And then you kind of get in a bit of a cycle which just keeps going until someone needs to like get in there and break that cycle and be like, okay, looking around at your meeting, in your meeting, do you have any disabled people there? Which you may not know because not all disabilities are visible, but like if you don't, you're doing something wrong because there should be disabled people there.
I think it is just that ignorance, right? And you would never consider that cycle that exists. But I feel like that's such a clear way to explain it and characterizes it so well. This idea that once you're not including disabled people, then the conversations aren't kind of relevant or inclusive, and then like it makes it an inaccessible space. I think that's like such a clear way of explaining it for a lot of people, even who have kind of never had to have these considerations before. Are there any kind of other obvious things that you think often people don't include? Because kind of I like also am involved with the Glasgow Uni Food and Body Positivity Society, and often like that as a small society, like we kind of overlook things, I think, a little bit. What do you think are some of the things that maybe people overlook just generally in terms of accessibility and making a movement open to everybody that it can be or should be?
Yeah, no, super good question. So I think that it's one of those things. So I feel like really the space that I can speak from is like disability, accessibility. But I'd say even within that, like that's so hugely broad. Do you know what I mean? Like one person's accessibility needs and someone else's are going to be totally different. But that being said, I feel like there are some basics that like it's really important to have. And I think once you have those basics, you've kind of created a culture where if someone comes across you and maybe actually you don't fit their accessibility needs, but they see that you are doing all of the other things, then I feel like a culture is created in which they would be able to be like, oh, I'm really keen on getting involved, but actually I would need X, Y, and Z, and feel able to ask for that because they can see that like things are being considered already. In terms of the basic things I just mentioned, I would say things like if you're using photos, putting a little image description of what the photo is for anyone that uses a screen reader who's visually impaired. And I think this is especially important. It's important with everything because everyone should be able to know what's in your photos, but especially important with our next meetings at this time, this place kind of thing, but you don't have a plain text of that underneath, then all of a sudden you're kind of being like, perhaps not intentionally, probably not intentionally, but you're kind of being like, oh, we don't want anyone that uses a screen reader to be here because they'll have no idea about it. So things like that are really just basic. And then, you know, when we get back to in person, thinking about where it is that you're physically holding your meetings. Like, is it a space where you can get to via a lift? Is it a place that's on a space that's like near public transport? Would people be able to get there by public transport? Are there disabled parking spots near where you're holding it? How could we set up the chairs and stuff for this meeting that if someone is hard of hearing or deaf and lip reads, how could we set these chairs up perhaps in a circle so that everyone can like see everyone talking? Just all kinds of things like this. And I think a lot of it is just like asking and kind of committing to like, okay, we want to be more accessible. You know, we know, like, so at the Luna Project, like, we know that we 100% will not be being fully accessible, but we like, we are a group of disabled people, so we listen, we share our experiences, we try to work out what's going to work, we research, and we really just try to keep ourselves as open as possible to the idea that, like, actually, yeah, of course we can change what we're doing. If that means the difference of like someone being there or not being there, then like, of course we'll change. And I think a lot of it is just creating that culture where people feel able to ask and to say like, actually, that's not going to work for me. Could we try this kind of thing?
Like, I don't know if it's just me feeling it, like sometimes a bit like there's a fear around asking these questions because you feel embarrassed that you don't already know, right? So it's really interesting, like, or it's really important, I guess I mean to say, that there's like an awareness that we can't know everything, and we should just be like, hi, like, I don't know like what quite I need to do in terms of accessibility, like what do I need to be doing, rather than just not providing it at all, of course. How's everyone doing in terms of, I feel like maybe this is like it's only now I'm realizing this is a strange juxtaposition between being like important accessibility issues and also like, how are your tortillas doing? I'm ready to go in the oven.
I think I'm good to go in the oven.
Same.
I've got so many of them, like they'll never fit. Like, I don't know if you see, but like there are piles and piles of them.
I currently have four trays. I have like a large tray, another large tray, another tray. And the reason we did all of this was, one, to give us, like, think we wouldn't have been able to have that long conversation there without the process of making the tortillas ourselves or making the nachos ourselves. So here we are. But fully, you know, it's a good time. I enjoy like doing extra stuff, even if it's not going to fit in our oven.
Me too. And you know, we actually, this kind of brings us on to a little conversation that we had like when we were just talking about this, that actually, like, yeah, like I really enjoyed making the tortillas, from like doing all that, and I'm excited to make the salsa too. But we had this conversation before that actually, you know, all of these things are completely optional. Like, if for you, maybe like you have an energy limiting condition, or maybe you have caring responsibilities, or any of these kind of things that mean that actually like this just isn't going to work for you, then there is no shame, and it's no less cooking to just, you know, get your like bag of tortillas and get your salsa and roll with that. There is no thing of like, it's got to be like this much effort in order to be cooking, because like it's all cooking.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, and I also think there's maybe an increasing awareness amongst like cooking communities of the idea that to ask for like really expensive ingredients isn't really on, because that's not something that everybody can do. But I feel like there's like less of an awareness maybe in like, I don't know, in kind of like recipe books or whatever, like making those recipes accessible for everybody. Even people's like, I mean, I saw a thing ages ago about like different utensils being accessible to use kind of to everybody. Even the fact that we like use scissors to cut our tortillas, I think on one hand makes it easier, but then, you know, for everybody. So I totally agree. Like, it's much better that like no matter how many steps or whatever you do to cook, that it is cooking. You're making delicious food. If you've got a meal at the end of it, who cares how you came about it? If it's tasty food. Okay, I'm trying to fit all of my sheets of tortillas into the oven. So I'm enlisting the help of the like bottom rack to like go in and like support us that way. Okay, right, I've wrangled things to fit, so I'm now putting my last batch of tortillas, or at least I'm attempting to. Hope everyone else is going well with everything. Ali, what stage are you at currently?
I'm just getting my tomatoes, and I'm gonna chop up my tomatoes. I think is my next step. What are you going for?
Well, a coincidence has it, I am at the exact same stage. A Cookalong indeed. Like, here we are.
I'm a very slow cutter, so I was getting a bit of a head start.
No, shout. We have the opportunity here with our few steps to take everything at our preferred pace. So for the salsa, we are just chopping the tomatoes, yes? Do you think there's any particular way to do this best?
I have literally no idea. I am going for like just chopping them. I quite like salsa that has like bits of tomato in it, so I'm not chopping them too small. But again, I think that's the thing, like things that are nice and simple, you can totally see how like what you're doing now will lead to what you're eating. And then I feel like you can be like, how do I want that to be when I'm eating that?
I don't have any salsa tips, but I think what you said there plays nicely into like ideas about intuitive eating, right? Like cut it how you want it, to your own kind of preferences. One thing I do have to say about salsa, I feel like salsa is one of those great things that you can just make. Like you have a tomato that's like right on the verge. Like one of the tomatoes I'm using, I bought quite some time ago. It wasn't looking so good. It got a bit squished in my fridge drawer, but I think it's going to make perfect salsa because like almost it's a bit better if it's a bit squishy. So if you're trying to prevent food waste and you've got tomatoes need using, just make a salsa.
I think that's the other good thing about a salsa. So I feel like as long as you have tomatoes, everything else you add, it can kind of just be whatever you have. And you'll end up with something that resembles salsa.
Yeah. Especially even in a visual way, right? Because salsa really is just like tomatoes. Like if you have that, it's gonna look like salsa, even if it doesn't taste like salsa. Okie dokie. I feel like we steamrolled through so many important topics there, and I'm like, wow, here we are, like half an hour in, and we've chatted about a lot.
We did.
Now we can chill out a bit, I think, and just at a leisurely pace.
Yeah.
Is this a good time to maybe ask everyone else how they're doing? Anyone cooking along like to weigh in with a comment?
I would love to hear how people's Haggis Nachos are going, but also any thoughts that anyone has about like accessibility, sustainability.
I'm kind of wondering a little bit about digital accessibility and if everything being online has actually made things more or less accessible for people with disabilities. So I'm just kind of wondering about that aspect. What have you found?
For sure. I think that's a really interesting thing to pick up on. And I think as well, almost some people, not most people, I'd say some people have kind of taken it to be like like everything's online now, boom, accessibility solved. We don't need to think about lifts. And it's kind of like, oh, hold up. Now we've like entered a whole new world of accessibility with digital accessibility. Yeah, I think that there is a lot with digital accessibility in the things of like, so for example, like for a lot of people, like actually like spending a lot of time looking at a screen and like having like back-to-back meetings or whatever, really tricky. And so actually if you're going to have like super long things that don't have like a little break and stuff, like that can be quite tricky for people. And same with, I'd say, a real big issue that keeps on being talked about in the disability community just now is the accessibility of online for deaf and hard of hearing people, because most things you can't have captioned, and for a lot of deaf people and hard of hearing people, actually like being with people, being able to pick up on like body language and just kind of like what you get from actually being with people, lip reading, etc. And when you've got things like video calls where there's like that lag, really, really tricky. But I would say from my experience, and I think the experience of a lot of my peers and from a lot of the conversations I've had, actually like all of this move online stuff has actually been pretty amazing in terms of accessibility stuff. Like I have been to far more, even just like sustainability and environment stuff, I've been to far more like sustainability and environmental meeting things since the pandemic started than before it started, even because even just from the point of view of like, it's perhaps not an accessibility, well, it is an accessibility thing, but it's not like perhaps one that people can do stuff about. But like if you don't have to like spend energy like traveling to get somewhere and then being there and then spend energy like getting home kind of thing, it all of a sudden, for me anyway, like becomes so much more accessible. Long story short, in some ways yes, in other ways no. Still got to be thinking about it.
I just burnt my tortillas, just if anyone's, I was making some strange faces because I was burning things. If things go wrong, no one has to feel bad. You know what I mean? Like, if we fail together. Anyway, once again, I'm talking about tortillas when actually I'm very interested in what you're saying. Do you think it's like another case of like kind of talking about how people with disabilities are left out of sustainability conversations, also kind of like web development as well? Like, do you think, like, I think it's like almost, you know, people joke about how like if men got periods, like period provisions would be like absolutely amazing. Like, it's maybe a case of like web developers generally are able-bodied, and so I mean that's a big generalization, but I just wonder, like, do you think that's a factor? Like, there's a lack of awareness and therefore like facilities for that?
I think 100%, and I feel like this is why it is so tricky, because I think you know, web development stuff 100%, but I think you can apply that to just about any area of society, like architects, like literally everyone. You have disabled people underrepresented and therefore not included in, so for example, architecture, web development or something, not included in this entire idea of like what works, like what is web design that works, or like what is a building that works. Disabled voices aren't influencing that, and then you end up with those things not working. And it's not just a case of like people like, oh, that's such a shame, like you can't go to this place, or like, oh, that's such a shame you can't access this. Like, you know, like if your schooling is online, or when school was in person, if you can't access parts of your school, like your classroom, then all of a sudden you can just see how these cycles like keep going and going and going. Which is why it's so important for to have these conversations, and especially for able-bodied people to have these conversations and think about like, oh, hold up, I'm in this space already. How can I invite disabled people into this space to have these conversations here, kind of thing. Yeah, because as we touched on before, like it's absolutely in no way like any kind of malicious anything, which I think kind of plays into, perhaps a tangent, but like kind of plays into, I think, people's perception of disabled people is very much an other, and actually like disabled people are 1 in 8 people, so they're absolutely not like the other. I think people just don't even think that disabled people would like want to be part of these spaces or should be part of these spaces, because they have this conception that they completely are this other. Then the cycles just keep going, which is so frustrating, because disabled people are, in some ways, you know, they're like exactly the same as the rest of anyone. You know, disabled people have like unique experiences. They are like some of the most like innovative, creative, adapting people ever, which is like incredible skills to be bringing to any conversation or movement. Frustrating.
Weirdly enough, I did my dissertation in human-computer interaction, and in my lecture review I was talking about digital accessibility, but it was quite surprising because one of the topics that I looked up was prediction, and that can obviously help people who have limited range of motion. And the example I found, which was one of the only examples I could find, was actually it was designed to benefit gamers and creatives in order to help them work faster, and it didn't even touch on people with disabilities. And I was really surprised actually, because I was like that's kind of where the market is. It was really interesting and quite disheartening.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That is so interesting. I feel like technology stuff is stuff that I know very little about, so that's super interesting. Yeah, but like, you know, like you say, like all it would have taken for like was at some point in the involvement of like that paper being written or that research being done, or like that the ideas for this being developed, for someone in there to like disabled or able-bodied, but like with accessibility on the brain, to be like, oh, this is super cool. We could also talk to this group of people and see how it would work for them, because I think it has a lot of potential.
Yeah, I think a really good example of this in like the like sustainability movement is in the Netherlands. They were encouraging people to use their bikes more by paying them like 22 cents for every mile they ride on their bike. That's quite like exclusionary of disabled people who aren't able to use a bike, and incentive for, you know, to not use vehicles and stuff. But also, like, a lot of disabled people are not, like, there is no other option than using a car or public transport. Like, where's that sort of like incentive there? And then are they being sort of like shunned for not taking that more eco-friendly option?
Again, like, it's just not being thought about, because like that, you know, on paper, great idea, and it is, and I feel like it kind of brings us into transport, which I think is kind of a really central part of like sustainability, accessibility, and sustainability, environmental things, but also accessibility things. But I always think it's really interesting that spaces where like environmental and sustainability things, I'm just going to check my tortilla chips, are being talked about, and like public transport is discussed a lot as like, okay, this is the way forward, da da da. But like the people that are having these conversations are the people who have like walked there or cycled there, or like don't actually have much experience of using public transport. Whereas like the disabled community, like there are some groups within the disabled community, like me, like I can't drive and I completely rely on public transport. And so like, you know, the me's who are like 60 years old and have been doing this for 60 years will like know the like all of the like, okay, this is how we could improve public transport to make it work for people because I have used it every day for the past 60 years or whatever. And so it just feels so mad to like be having those conversations without disabled people who like actually have so much to bring to those conversations. It really does, because they've kind of got this like expertise. So for example, like I know that there was a conversation had like within a Glasgow group recently about like, oh, you know, the subway, that's pretty cool, gets you places really super speedy, amazing, like why don't we like try and make that more affordable, or like really encourage people to use that and kind of really focus funding on that as like the big transport option. And it's kind of like, okay, that's amazing, the subway's amazing, but there's only one station that has a lift, so you actually, if you can't get up and down those like 1,000,001 stairs, you literally can go nowhere on the subway. And you know, that's not just disabled people, like if you've got a pram, any of these things, the subway just doesn't work. And so it's like, okay, so maybe the conversation needs to be shifted to either that funding first of all needs to go to making the subway accessible, and then it can be pushed as like, okay, this is like the mode of transport in Glasgow, or like think about where else you could be like thinking this. Yeah.
I want to take a moment to check in with you and how you're doing on your recipe. How are you doing, Ali? Like, what stage are you at?
I'm good. I've taken my like top tray of nachos out of the oven and then moved the other ones up because some of them are like really done and some of them are not done. And I've cut my tomato and my onion. And so I'm thinking about like adding my last little bits to my salsa. How about where are you?
I'm currently slicing an onion, a red onion.
I have a question for Alison, another one. So obviously everyone is celebrating the pedestrianisation that happened just outside the university, and and that happened in a few places in Aberdeen as well, where I'm from, and everyone really loves it and celebrates it. But I know, like, in terms of like my mum trying to get my grandma to places, she's like, this is an absolute nightmare because she can just not go to the same appointments that she used to go to, and my grandma is obviously very old at this point. And you know, she has to change all these like go to different people who she's not comfortable with appointments. She doesn't know, they don't understand her. And there's definitely a balance between improving the sustainability of a city and also making sure that it's still accessible. In terms of improving the air quality of the city centre actually means that less people are actually going to the city centre. So I'm just wondering if you've kind of had any experiences with that.
Yeah, so I think everything you've said is so good to bring to this conversation, because absolutely, and I think even that thing of you know, if you are that person for whom you're like, oh, everyone's celebrating this is a really great thing, I should be celebrating this too, but actually it's not really working for me, you can totally see how that like leads to like disabled people feeling quite othered from these kind of movements, because it's kind of like, oh well, if this is the good thing and I don't fit into that, then okay. I think that again, it's that kind of like, because it's not a case of like either we have accessibility or sustainability, like they literally go hand in hand. Like as you said with like the air pollution stuff, like you know, that's amazing. Like that's a huge accessibility thing, like places being less polluted. So they really do naturally go hand in hand, but it's just working out like how to make all details of them work together. And so I think the Glasgow pedestrianised bits I'm thinking of, I'm like, oh yeah, amazing. But like, it would be great if, for example, like the one I can think of, like walking along one with a friend who's in a wheelchair, and it's great. It's like this beautiful new pavement, but it's super like up, 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 and it's like, oh, could this not just be smooth? Like maybe it wouldn't look as nice or whatever, but actually that's not really like it doesn't really make a difference. You've still got this beautiful pedestrianized street, even if like the actual like nitty gritty bits don't look as nice. That's not really what matters. And again, I think that's where it comes back to like having disabled people in those conversations. And like you talked about your gran and your mum, and actually probably if someone had talked to them before this happened, they would probably have been able to flag like, oh, this does sound good, but I think this was probably going to cause some issues with this. And so having those conversations at the very beginning of things means that you can come up with like amazing creative solutions that actually do work for everyone.
I'm so interested. Sorry, I was thinking in terms of like consultation process, then, do you feel like it would be more of an effort to reach out to the disabled community and ensure like that consultation process will not be kind of viable unless you have results from that community? Do you think that that's something that should be considered more in the council or the government?
I think for sure. I think that that's such a good idea. And I think that, you know what, like as a community, as pretty much any community where voices are frequently marginalized, like people have a lot to say. And if you give them a platform to say it, like, gosh, do you know what I mean? Like you'll be there for hours because it's a lifetime of experiences that have shaped like your like opinions, and you now have this expertise. And I would say that, yeah, I think that would be amazing if there was some kind of thing that was like all consultations must include disabled people, because it's where you kind of get the issue that we kind of touched on before of like, okay, so let's say you did make the consultation you were holding totally accessible, like in every possible way it was accessible, but you're doing that on top of a legacy of like a movement and perhaps even like a group or an institution that hasn't been accessible. So it's not just a case of like, oh well, we've made it accessible so people will come to this now. I think that there's the more like, okay, so we've made it accessible so now people can come to this, and now we really need to like engage with communities to make sure that like this is something that they want to be at because we want them to be there.
It just makes me think like from some of the work like at Guess that we did earlier in the year where we worked with like to promote the Glasgow City Food Plan. I was kind of, it's on a similar vein-ish about kind of getting like the opinions of people that might be excluded usually from kind of public documents and like consulting on whatever it is. It just like, I was quite impressed. Like I think a lot of organizations actually, when you dig down to it, because they have these resources, like they have everything going on, like they have the capacity to kind of reach out to specific people. So I wonder if that's like a kind of point of action for people that maybe aren't in the disabled community and are able-bodied but could be doing, you know, is like making sure that when decisions are made, like special kind of provision is being made to reach out to people who kind of are normally excluded. Because you know, like just that, my point is council organizations often have a lot of resources and are able to kind of make the extra effort. Like the Glasgow City Food Plan, they were like thinking of all these elaborate plans, like, okay, we're going to put the plans in libraries, we're going to like send them out to people. So it's like genuinely accessible for as many people. They were specifically trying to make it accessible for people from kind of low income backgrounds who might not come to like different consultation events or have kind of the digital technology or whatever to fill in the consultation. Basically, it is possible, and I think if we were kind of all more aware of this, we could be doing a better job at making sure that whatever body it is that's making a decision is including the voices of everybody, particularly disabled people.
Completely. And I think that like, you know, people aren't just one thing, like people will be many things. And I think that, you know, especially because like there's a big overlap between the disabled, because like so many people are disabled, they end up appearing in just about every, well, they're in every single community. And so as soon as you know, like, it is just that thing of creating a thing where it's like, okay, we want to hear from everyone, and then you will get the people who are like all of these different identities and bringing like the way that because, you know, you could have like maybe like a person and their experience of disability is like one experience of it, not just have it as like okay, we've talked to one disabled person in consultation for the disability box, and we've got a really wonderfully well-rounded view of disability, because absolutely not. Like, it's such such a diverse group and community.
I think that's a really important point, like the intersectionality of all these different identities, absolutely, and so many different perspectives that exist. And like you say, it's in everybody's interest to hear from these communities. It just is a no-brainer, really, like once you kind of have an awareness of it. Once again, here I am checking in on how everyone's doing in terms of cooking. I've just added the coriander to my salsa, and I'm thinking maybe to put the haggis in the microwave.
I've now put my haggis in the microwave too.
Just as an aside, while we're talking about haggis, because I'm obsessed with haggis currently, McSween's haggis made with sustainable palm oil. Further question, is it better to boycott palm oil, or just because I feel like people generally are like, palm oil is really bad, should we not eat palm oil? But in fact, palm oil actually, if it's grown sustainably, because it like uses a lot less land to produce. Also, maybe everyone knows this because you're all people at a guest Cookalong, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. It like uses a lot less land space for the yield of oil that it produces. So actually, if it's done sustainably, it's really good for the, well, okay, maybe it's not good for the environment, but it's like better for the environment than a lot of different oils. But because there's so much of like a boycott palm oil situation, it means that maybe we're going to lose this opportunity of this actually quite good oil. But anyway, I just thought I'd say that. McSween's, in other news, they collaborated with M&S this year. Like, here we have the classic McSween's, but all the M&S haggises were also McSween's, which I was excited to see as a McSween fan. I'm just haggis obsessed. I don't know what I'm saying. Is there anything else interesting about haggis? I've actually never eaten real haggis. Only.
Me neither. I don't know what it tastes like, the meat one, so. But I don't want to change it. I mean, the vegan one is delicious.
Yeah, it's so good. It's kind of sad that we only get to have it like officially once a year.
Not officially, but unofficially I have it quite often. Not quite often.
Where do you find it all year round? Where is
Waitrose.
Is it always at Waitrose?
It's always at Waitrose, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, the vegan one.
Classic. See, Waitrose just has everything. That's why I got my one this time, and
Same.
it's just great to go into.
Have me as well.
Charlotte, as someone that works at Waitrose, do you have any insider knowledge to share with us? What about any sustainability scoops or accessibility scoops?
Yeah, I do.
Thank you.
But I feel like this is more like a general thing. So yeah, like every evening, loads and loads of fresh food just goes into the bin, which is massively heartbreaking and really, really sad. So like some of it gets donated, but only stuff that can like technically be frozen, which is actually like not that much, even though like, because bread you can freeze, but like if it's not written on the package, then they can't take it, even though like obviously it's fine to freeze. So as a result, a lot of stuff gets wasted and goes to the bin, which is devastating. But it was also why I take back massive crates. So I have like, you know, those big crates that you have in like supermarkets that people won't carry stuff with. I have like so many of those in my house because like every time I'm working, I bring back like anything that was gonna go in the bin. And then there's like a squat near the Waitrose that I work at that has like a community fridge. So then I just like shove everything in there and then carry on my life.
Basically, because I've been seeing on your Instagram story that you've been redistributing some stuff on the sly. For anyone else that works in a supermarket, or how have you been going about it? Like, what are your strategies?
So I personally just have to say it's all for me. So like my managers know that I do it, but because I asked one time when like we have these little meetings, and I was like, oh, can any of the food go there? And they were like, no, because of like health hazard, something or other, some legal, whatever. But like they were like, and if you take it, you can do whatever you want with it. So I basically am just like, I'm gonna take all these like 47 sandwiches and like 2 turkeys for my house. And like obviously they know that I'm not, but that's the only way that it can happen. Yeah.
Charlotte fights the machine. Back to haggis discussions. My haggis is currently in the microwave. I haven't covered it. Do you think that's a faux pas, Ali? As a haggis expert that
I have no idea. I also put mine in uncovered and I didn't even think to cover it. So now you've got me worried that I should have covered my haggis. We'll just have to hope. We'll have to hope it's all good.
I'm just like, I'm so happy in this that if we've both done the same thing wrong, like we're in it together. So I'm sticking with uncovered, in which case it's gonna be good. And also my kitchen is starting to smell like haggis now, which of course is my favorite thing. Ali, how are you doing? Is your haggis? Mine's out, so I feel like yours must be out too.
Mine's out. I just popped it on top of my thing and I'm just gonna grate some cheese on top of my thing.
Okay, so yeah, is there a particular order to this? Like you go nachos, haggis, cheese?
So I think I'm gonna go like some like splodges of haggis and then like in between like splodges of salsa and then cheese on the top. But I'm really not sure. I feel like maybe there could be a strategy for like which one you put under, like in which order. Because maybe you don't want your salsa touching your tortilla chips because maybe it'll make it all soggy. But also maybe you don't want it being like cooked by the oven.
Fair, I actually love soggy nachos. Like just on the like salsa on nachos question, like I love soggy nachos. Like I actually prefer them to crunchy nachos. I would just like to, I feel like this has been a half an hour of like sidetrack, and I just want to open the floor for any further questions for Ali or points about accessibility and sustainability, or Ali, if there's anything else you want to say before we hop onto the final stage, which is putting our nachos in the oven.
I would so love to hear any thoughts that people have or any like, anything.
So before this, I was like doing a bit of research, and there was like a survey done by the UN, and it was like a survey of like disabled people who are living in places where natural hazards occur, and obviously that's increasing because of the climate crisis. And 80% of disabled people said that they just couldn't evacuate, like in that moment, in that crisis. Like if there was to be an evacuation, it just wouldn't be possible. And like it would take some time, a lot of preparation and stuff. 6% they just wouldn't be able to leave. They just wouldn't leave at all because of like accessibility and stuff. And only 20% said that they might be able to go. And I think like, and also like if you look at like statistics from like hurricane and stuff like that, like you see that disabled people are more disproportionately affected by this. Like there's disproportionately much more deaths and stuff like that, because often like accessibility needs just aren't taken into account when it comes to evacuation and stuff like that. And I think that like shows why accessibility is so central to like the sustainability and like environmental sort of movement, because like these people just are disproportionately affected by it the most. Also like public transport just isn't an option for a lot of disabled people, because like to take example where Ali lives in Leeds, like you live on like quite a steep hill, so to get to the train station near you, like it wouldn't be possible if you were just pushing a wheelchair or even on crutches. It's quite difficult.
Ross, thank you so much for bringing all of that stuff up, because I feel like that's a whole important part of this conversation, that disabled people, everyone needs to be part of these conversations about the climate crisis and stuff. But then when you look at the fact that disabled people seem to be more adversely affected in the most extreme ways by the climate crisis, then it makes it feel even more frustrating and even more like obvious that of course they should be involved in these conversations. Gosh, thank you for sharing all of that, Ross. Thank you.
I think it's like a very important awareness that there needs to be in like the sustainability movement, that often the people that are like most marginalized, like indigenous people, disabled people, as we're talking about, are the people that are most affected. So it's all very well like having your kind of activism or like your kind of personal efforts, but those are definitely like the kind of like, not even being dramatic, the life or death conversations to be being had, you know? Absolutely. So thank you, Ross.
Also, like with the climate crisis, there comes also like higher risk of more infectious diseases and stuff like that. And obviously, like as we can see with like coronavirus and everything, like again, that disproportionately affects people, and the way people respond and go about it is often quite ableist.
Ross, you're like coming and dropping these like huge conversation topics. Yeah, no, I think it is. Yeah, I think you're right. I think we see it so acutely with everything just now that, yeah, all the evidence seems to suggest that the climate crisis has contributed to this pandemic and like will continue to contribute to pandemics in the future. And there feels no question about it that like the people that are affected worse by this are marginalized groups, and within that, disabled people. Like it's, you know, there are disabled people that have been shielding since literally the beginning of March and like have not, like, I've even seen people within the disability community who are like, I can't wait to get my vaccine. It will be the first time I've left my house in almost a year. Like, you know, like everyone's been affected by this, and you know, everyone in ways that like, you know, you just don't know from talking to people how they have been affected. But I think certainly within the disabled community, there's been like a lot of challenges quite unique to the disabled community. The stakes feel a lot higher because all the evidence suggests that actually like if you get ill, then it's going to be so much worse. And you are paired with that, seeing people just blatantly not following the rules, not caring, both on like a government level and at an individual level, to see like friends and family kind of effectively be like, well, I don't care about disabled lives. And of course, that's not just disabled people, that's people from all different kinds of marginalized groups and actually just everyone. But it feels like it's really highlighted as a conversation.
And I think also like with like focusing on like sustainability and stuff, like in that conversation, like, you know, like sustainable clothing and stuff like that, often that just isn't accessible at all. Especially like in America, you're only considered disabled if you can't work. So for example, like Ali, you'd be able to work, but in America, you wouldn't be considered disabled by the government because they have like an economic sort of view of disability. It's your relationship to like capitalism and stuff. And like, so like buying from places like Primark and stuff like that, which aren't sustainable and obviously not very moral, like are often the only sort of like places, you know, disabled people can access like clothes to put on their backs and stuff like that.
Just from a perspective of not knowing, what are the like accessibility concerns with sustainable fashion, like as that example?
Yeah, so I'm happy to hop on in here. So I think Ross, you've like highlighted really well the like economic barriers that can come with sustainable fashion, but also things like, for example, like if you are maybe if you're a wheelchair user or if you have certain sorts of mobility aids, then actually like, so, you know, we can think of people within the Luna community who it's only like very certain sorts of shoes that work with the mobility aids that they use, and also they wear through them at such a rate because they walk slightly differently. But actually, do you know what I mean? The fact that they're buying a new pair of Primark trainers every month, like that's not the, do you know what I mean? That shouldn't be the thing that's like come down on us, like this is the problem, because it's the difference between them being able to like be out and about and walking comfortably in shoes and not.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Ali. Ali, like what stage are you at currently?
So I've just popped mine in the oven. I've put on a little stopwatch, so they've been in there for 4 minutes. So I'm not really sure how long they're gonna need, but yeah, I'm still cooking away.
I'm finally putting these into the oven. Like, here I am, a bit late, not crazy late, but.
Also, at any point when people's Haggis Nachos are ready, like, go eat them while they're warm. Amazing. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming along.
Our Haggis Nachos are in the oven. We're ready to eat. Some of us are already eating, but that's what you get when you try and cook along. Thank you so much, Ali, for joining me. It's been great. Like, you've had so much to say. I'm actually excited to edit this so I can reabsorb it for a second time. It's going to be great. Thanks everyone else for joining. Hope you enjoy your Haggis Nachos, and have a great evening. Bye-bye.